Culture 7. Exercises 5 and 6.
The Great Depression began at the end of the 1920s and lasted until the end of the 1930s. It was the worst depression in history, and it began with the Wall Street crash of October 1929. During that crash, the stock exchange fell by 89%, and many investors lost all of their money. But why did that have such a bad effect on the rest of the country? After all, most ordinary people had nothing to do with Wall Street and no money to invest anyway. Why did they suffer when the stock market fell? Basically, when the Wall Street crash happened, the whole nation lost confidence in the country's economy. Banks did not want to lend money to people who needed it, and people with money did not want to keep it in banks. As a result, more than half of the 25,000 banks in the USA went out of business. People were very anxious about the economic situation, so they were careful with their money. They didn't spend much, so shops went out of business and people lost their jobs. Factories began to close down, and more people became unemployed. In 1930, 4 million Americans were looking for work but could not find it. A year later, the number was 6 million. Because there were not enough jobs, many people could not afford to pay the rent for their homes. In America's towns and cities, there were more and more homeless people. The president, Herbert Hoover, did not want to take any action. He believed that the situation would get better soon by itself, but he was wrong. It got worse. Much worse. By 1932, about 15 million people, that's 25% of the working population, could not find a job. In 1932, the American people elected a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He decided that he needed to help the economy out of depression, and he did this by spending huge amounts of government money on big projects. He used these projects to give work to millions of unemployed people. And he often spoke to the American people over the radio, trying to improve confidence. His efforts did help the economy, but in fact, the start of the Second World War in 1939 helped much more. Finally, the factories and workers were busy again. By 1940, unemployment was down to 10%. Remember, it had been around 25% in 1932. But it took until 1954 for the New York Stock Exchange to reach the same level as before the Wall Street crash of October 1929.